The provinces are slowly opening up from the COVID-19 lockdown. A new normal is here for businesses in our physical distancing world. What will work and the economy look like in the post-pandemic world? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. We're coming to you from a remote location and practicing physical distancing to enhance safety. While Ontario and Quebec grapple with the need for more testing, they are moving ahead with lifting restrictions on businesses to resume operations. What will that look like, though? Strict safety protocols will likely be in place to protect customers and employees. The challenge will be large office buildings, which will have to adapt. And while this pandemic has dealt a vicious blow to the economy, one economist we'll talk to later does see some opportunities. First, Lindsay Tedds is an economist and a professor at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy, and she joins us now. And Lindsay, how would you characterize the Canadian economy before COVID-19?
Well, it was creeping along. We had already seen signs of softening in the last quarter of 2019. It's been really hard to eke out growth over the last couple of years, and with some softness in the natural resource sector, as well as some very challenging relationships with China even before the pandemic. It was already soft. This pandemic then just put it right over the edge.
Mm-hmm. From your perspective, do you feel provinces are rushing too fast to reopen?
This is going to be a really, really difficult decision to make, and I don't envy anybody in that situation. I think one of the things that people forget, though, is that the softening that we saw in early February was not the result of restrictions. It was the result of people curtailing their own demand in the face of the news about the pandemic. And the lifting of the restrictions isn't what automatically means that we just get right back to normal. People have to feel comfortable to resume their activities. And what we are indeed seeing is that many people are not comfortable. And so it's not just a matter of restrictions, it's also a matter of people feeling like they can start going back to, quote unquote, their day-to-day lives.
What challenges do you see for businesses in this new normal?
Oh, boy. It's going to just depend on the kind of business. Like restaurants are not going to be at 100% capacity for a long time, if ever. They're going to have to put a lot of restrictions in place if they're ever going to have people eating in the restaurants. I know a lot of the smaller restaurants here in Calgary, for example, are sticking with a takeaway. There is no sitting in the restaurants or thing like that. Stores are going to have to be careful about queuing. We were at the garden store a couple of weeks ago, and they had to control the people entering and leaving a very, very large space. And then you have problems with people physically distancing while queuing. Canadians are pretty good at queuing, but, sometimes we're not always as conscious about other people's spaces. And then what you're talking about, people working in offices, getting back into that requires people that are in those office spaces to have an understanding of ventilation, for example. What is the flow of airflow, and do they need to restructure their office space to ensure the safety of their people? And we're already seeing some of the large companies. Shopify did the big announcement in Toronto. They're going to keep a lot of their operations permanently at home. And so, it's going to be very, very different for a lot of different businesses.
Lindsay Tedds joining us on the Unpublished Cafe. She's an economics professor at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. And I've been reading some of your material. Why do you feel women will face the brunt of the economic impact from the pandemic?
Well, we were the ones who faced it first. When the schools were one of the first things that were closed before a lot of the other restrictions went in place. Here in Alberta, the closures of schools, for example, was announced Sunday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And suddenly we had to restructure our lives for the next day because our young kids were now at home. And last time I checked, leaving a 7-year-old at home is not really a good idea. Childcare facilities were shut down. So we felt it first, and then, when the restrictions started to come in place, this predominantly affected female-dominated industries like accommodations, restaurants, travel, and the like. Then lifting these restrictions, like if you think about those industries and what I just talked about, right? Restaurants and bars, they're not going to be at full capacity for a while. So that means they're not going to bring all of their staff back. When we talk about travel, we're not going to be sitting in an airplane side by side like we used to. There's going to have to be some serious restrictions put in place to make sure that we have this under control. And the fact that, we're seeing restrictions being lifted on childcare, but those facilities themselves are actually not necessarily opening back up. We're seeing this particularly here in Alberta and Calgary. Well, day camps, for example, are allowed to proceed. A lot of them have just gone, no, we can't take on this liability. So again, it's not as simple as, we're slowly getting back to normal, because we're never going to get back to normal. But if we don't start thinking about what it is that those of us who have been hardest by this need, we are going to set women back in their economic participation in this economy by 30 years. And that's really concerning, because in the last 30 years, the economic growth we have been eking out has been from two sources. One, from natural resources, and two, from women entering into the economy. So making sure that they can participate is essential for our economic growth.
I'm wondering, thinking more big picture here, opportunities for Canadians in the new normal. And, when we see retail is going to have to start hiring more people because they have to, sanitize, they need more hands on the ground as well. There's been talking about, maybe Canada could become a hub for personal protective equipment manufacturing. Do you see opportunity there?
When you talk about retail, whether or not they're going to be able to hire more people is actually quite dependent on how much our behavior has changed in this pandemic. We are shopping a lot online. How much our behavior changed, over an 8-week period was something that we hadn't even accomplished in a 15-year period before. We are seeing retailers actually announcing bankruptcy, and they're also announcing that they're not going back to brick and mortar stores. Instead, they're going to go the Amazon route with just warehouse hubs in places, and they'll just be doing delivery. So I'm not sure we're going to see a lot of hiring necessarily in that retail sector. Is there an opportunity for innovation? Absolutely. We saw this. Firms and businesses that are going to and did survive fairly well during this pandemic were the ones that pivoted. You have your local breweries switch from manufacturing alcohol to hand sanitizer. You had clothing manufacturers producing masks with some really great designs. And so there's always opportunity for innovation in these times, and in fact, that is going to be really important for our economy moving forward. Because while and I've said it a few times here, people talk about going back to normal. Normal is not what we're going back to. This is, a transformation in our economy. It's going to look different. It's going to feel different. And the businesses that are innovative are the ones that are going to come out shining from this.
How long do you see Canada getting back to, or at least the economy getting back to close to where it was before the pandemic?
So I've always been in the checkmark kind of style recovery. I'm not a V or a U. This was a deep dive. I don't think we're going to stay down at that low point that long, but the incline afterwards is going to be more like the 90s recession. It's going to be slow, and I think it's going to be several years before we see getting back to that level of economic activity that we had before. part of it is going to really actually depend on, though, we're going to have a lot of businesses that won't survive this. Some people are talking as much as 50 to 60%, and that's based off of what we see of businesses that are not able to open up back up after, say, a hurricane. And this is much more of a shock than a hurricane, for example. If we are able to get people to replace those entrepreneurs, to replace those businesses through innovative activity, the slope will be steeper, but it's still going to be a long, plodding recovery.
Lindsay, I want to thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Lindsay Tedds is a professor at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. We think about the new normal when it comes to leaving our homes and doing the shopping, but what could it look like when you return to work in, say, that high-rise? Brent McKnight is the associate professor at strategic management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University, and he joins us now. And Brent, workplaces aren't all one-size-fits-all. When you think about Canadians going back to work, which do you see as presenting the biggest challenges?
Yeah, this is certainly the case. There's so many different types of workplaces, so many different types of work. And certainly we're going to have to see how each of these types of work can be effectively continued with. Offices buildings, huge office buildings with thousands of people in them, small numbers of elevators. Certainly that's one type of work. Retail, another type of work, where you've got people, a lot of unknown people coming into a facility, a workplace. So I think you're going to have to look at each individual situation very carefully to figure out what are the risks and what needs to be done in each of those scenarios.
You know, and I think of a company that is, set up shop in a high-rise office tower. I mean, if they're going to start reopening, they're obviously going to have to, follow the social distancing rules, 2 meters apart, mandatory PPE, et cetera. What I'm wondering is that these folks are going to, I think, are going to have to start renting out more space, are they not? Because they're going to require more space just for the employees.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Right now, everyone's working from home, and I think quite a few companies are finding that this is working out fairly well for them in a lot of the functions that they operate. We had to do this very quickly. We didn't have a lot of time to go online and to go remotely. And with more time, they can make those arrangements even stronger. So I think I'd expect to see a variety of ways to reduce the number of people that need to be in an office environment. Either using shift work, which might be effective in some office environments, particularly probably effective in some manufacturing environments. But other approaches would be prioritizing what functions do need to be in the office, right? And maybe what people need to be in the office.
Do you see a growth, I guess, in people working from home? It's a nice thing to do now, but do you want to see that become a permanent thing?
I don't know. I think some people are enjoying it. I think some people are really finding this very hard. So I don't think this is we should all work from home or we shouldn't. But I definitely think that this has shown even skeptics that this can be done. And perhaps it should be more of a part of our work environment than we thought it could be. I don't see it replacing the need to be co-located and with other people, but certainly it could play a role. One key function I think that's going to be interesting is often we'll put our functions like digital marketing or fulfillment or supply chain or whatever all together in one spot. That's the area that we go to when we need that kind of help. But in a COVID world where one person in that environment gets sick, then you have a potential risk to an entire function of your business. So I think redundancy and being careful about which critical functions should be in the office at what time will be a key element to think about.
Brent McKnight joining us on the Unpublished Cafe, Associate Professor of Strategic Management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University, as we talk about what returning to work might look like. And it's going to depend on where you do work, that's for sure. Collaboration and teamwork are hallmarks for successful businesses. And in this new normal of keeping distances, the boardroom meeting, I can't see that lasting much longer. What are companies going to try and do to replace, that collaboration, cooperation?
Yeah, that's really tricky. And companies that have, there's a big difference between collaborating with someone online once you've met them face to face and had that interaction, and collaborating online with never having met them face to face. And as we go forward with this, increasingly there's going to be people that join a company or come along and you need to interact with them without having physically met them. I think that's going to pose some communication challenges. I think culture is obviously a critical element for companies to make sure they don't let up on finding creative ways to bring people together and get them to talk to each other beyond just the business of business, because that's a critical thing you miss when you're face to face with people and in the same office environment, and that brings trust, and that trust facilitates communication. So culture is going to be critical, and making sure that you don't get sloppy and lazy, I guess, with building opportunities to enhance culture.
We're obviously talking about, returning to work post COVID-19, or I guess still between the first and second wave. Masks, temperature checks, they're all going to be part of the new normal. Do you expect to see this growing everywhere?
I think so. I think a prime concern is going to be an employee feeling safe. If you're going back to work, you want to feel safe where you're working. And right now we feel safe at home. And, even when we leave the house, even to go get groceries, we kind of feel a little funny. And that's going to take a lot to break down. And so whatever companies can do to make their employees feel safe is what they're going to do. And I think testing is part of that, not just temperatures and temperature taking and masks and whatnot, which is important. But there are testing technologies on the horizon that will allow you to, within a span of half an hour or an hour, get some sense of exposure. So I would expect to see those be new business models, even for companies that would offer tests like that for offices and whatnot. So safety and feeling comfortable is a critical goal for helping employees get back.
We've talked an awful lot about returning to work in the office buildings, retail, that kind of a thing. But, the one thing I'm kind of curious about, I don't know if you've thought about this or not, but what is dining out going to look like in this new COVID world?
Yeah. I've got to admit, I have not even done takeout since this thing started. And I don't know whether I'm being overly cautious. I'm sure I am, because people say it's perfectly safe. And there's no issues with that. But it is uncomfortable, right? I think one of the challenges obviously is going to be scale. These restaurants typically need to fill their chairs on busy weekend days. And if they can only fill a third of them, that's a real problem. In fact, it might not even make a business viable in that environment. So I'd expect to see a lot more takeout options still. I'd expect to see some innovation. I'd hope to see some innovation in how restaurants are delivering for their customers.
Brent, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was great.
Brent McKnight's Associate Professor of Strategic Management at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University. While the pandemic has turned our world upside down, the new normal for businesses could provide more opportunity. The Canadian economy shed almost 2 million jobs in April on top of the 1 million lost in March. Sheila Block is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and she joins us now. And Sheila, how do you see the pandemic changing workers' responsibilities?
Well, I see the pandemic changing workers' responsibilities in a large number of ways. The first of those is everybody needs to take care of their own health, and it's particularly important because if you don't take care of your own health and protect yourself, then you could potentially be infecting your family and the wider public at large. In terms of a lot of jobs, there isn't going to be a change in responsibilities. If you're a lawyer or an accountant, your job is pretty much the same. I think it's really in those very public-facing service sector jobs that there's really potential for expanded responsibilities in terms of people who used to be responsible for, selling or being a cashier, also have expanded responsibilities really around public health. That could be crowd control, that could be a lot more sanitizing. Those are the kinds of tasks that will likely be added to those forward-facing service sector workers.
So that won't be a situation where they would hire more people for that. They just spread the work out amongst what they have.
Well, what we know so far, which is, we're in very early days here, is that if you have a reduced number of people in any business establishment, then likely you need less people to serve them. And so what I think we would be seeing is additional responsibilities put onto existing employees.
Now, for businesses to get going again, they'll need substantial changes to the way they operate. Do you expect a lot of them are going to adapt those changes, or they'll just maybe throw in the towel?
Well, I think that's the $64,000 question. To operate economically, to be able to continue operating and make a profit. We know a lot of, in particular, small establishments and small restaurants have people seated very close together. We know that in retail, you want to bring people into the store. You don't want to keep them out of the store. So I think for a lot of establishments, the real question is, can they operate and continue to operate profitably at the reduced volume that they're likely to see over the short term?
Businesses are fragile from the pandemic. How do you protect yourself as a worker and the customers if your employer is trying to cut corners?
Well, I think really that's where we're seeing yet again how important the role of government is, because we know that individual employees, when they have to choose between putting food on the table and the potential of getting ill, will often be forced to choose putting food on the table. So what we need is strong regulations that tell us from a scientific basis what is safe and what isn't safe, and that will probably evolve as knowledge evolves. But perhaps even more importantly, we need enforcement. So we need to make sure that inspections are being made from a health and safety perspective, and that orders are being enforced against employers who violate them, and that workers are protected so that they don't lose their livelihood if they take time off sick or if they actually act as whistleblowers. And that's a tall order. That's going to be a tough one.
I'm wondering, do you see an opportunity for the Canadian economy to pivot in another direction? In the fallout from COVID-19, let's face it, the oil and gas sector is down. I'm wondering, there was a talk at the beginning of the pandemic about, being a leader in healthcare, being a leader in personal protective equipment. Do you see an opportunity there?
I see a lot of opportunities here. As I think there's a real opportunity for us to shift to a Green New Deal. I see a real opportunity in this moment where the wider public is really seeing the value of care work, for an investment in that kind of work by governments, for an investment in sustainability and in the kinds of investments that will lead us to a kind of greener economy, and that has to do with retrofitting buildings, that has to do with really smart investments in public transit, as opposed to kind of stupid politically motivated ones. So I see there's a whole bunch of opportunities. And I think one of the real lessons from this is that we need to make stuff here again. And as opposed to just, being a center for finance, which Toronto largely is at this point, we really need to make things. And I think it's been really kind of interesting where you see auto plants in Ontario retooling and making PPE, making personal protective equipment. And I think it's a kind of sobering thought of it. What if we didn't even have that existing manufacturing again? At this point, it's much shrunk than it used to be. But if we didn't have those plants, we would all have been in a lot more trouble. So I think there's really, there's a potential for us to make more stuff. I think there's a potential for us to move on to a greener path. And I think there's also potential to really recognize the huge economic and social value of caring work.
Sheila, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Sheila Block's a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And this leads to our unpublished .vote question. If you're not an essential services worker, how concerned are you about returning to work after the pandemic? Very concerned, a little concerned, or not concerned at all? You can log on and vote right now at unpublished.vote and have your voice heard. I want to thank Lindsay Tedds of the University of Calgary, Brent McKnight from McMaster, and Sheila Block of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives for joining us. And I want to thank you for listening to the Unpublished Cafe. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.